What is going on, guys? This is Dr. Ryan Garner with Apothecary Wellness. In today's Industry Insight video, we're going to be talking about newer drugs that tend to be higher cost and what's driving their utilization. So let's jump into it. So there's essentially three domains that drive utilization of these newer, higher cost medications. The first one is going to be that the newer, more expensive medication actually has clinical superiority or has the opportunity to improve outcomes relative to its predecessors or other drugs that were the gold standard. The second domain that can drive the utilization comes down to improved safety, side effect profile, or possibly even ease of use. And the final domain that can drive utilization of these drugs are things outside of our clinical scope and can relate more to industry partners driving their utilizations, such as PBMs or manufacturers finding new indication to help extend patents of these brand name drugs. When talking about the first domain, we talked about drugs having superiority to its predecessors. Now, one of the first ones that comes to mind for me, and if you follow me on LinkedIn, you've likely seen me post about it, is a drug like Entresto. Now, Entresto, primarily through the Paradigm study, showed an absolute superiority to the gold standard of care when it came to heart failure patients. Now, prior to this study, the gold standard therapy for heart failure individuals consisted of having an ACE inhibitor, something like lisinopril, enalapril, ramipril, or an ARB or angiotensin receptor blocker, something like losartan, olmesartan, valsartan. And this study was very unique in the sense that it wasn't just comparing this new drug to placebo, it was actually being compared to what patients who experience this health condition are commonly being prescribed. Now, in this study, we compared Entresto to the highest tolerable dose of enalapril, and we did see a significant decrease in hospitalizations due to heart failure, as well as death from cardiovascular causes. Now, with superiority like this, we're going to have a change in prescribing habits because we know we can get better outcomes for these individuals. Now, Entresto usually runs somewhere between $500 to $600 a month relative to something like enalapril, which it was compared against in the Paradigm study, that can be literally just a few dollars per month. But the improved outcomes, like decreased hospitalizations, decreased death from cardiovascular causes, warrants its use over the previous gold standard. Now, also under this domain, doesn't necessarily have to be clinical superiority, but can be additional benefit beyond what it was created for. An example that comes to mind for me is something like a sodium glucose transport uptake inhibitor, or you might know them as Jardiance, Farxiga, Invokana. As technically Steglatro fits into this category, but doesn't have the same kind of properties that the other three do. Now, these drugs were developed to assist with A1C or blood glucose reduction for type 2 diabetics. But what we have found is that for individuals with diabetes and cardiovascular disease, as well as with individuals who have heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, as well as select individuals with severe kidney disease, there is additional benefit for their survival as well as their hospitalizations when utilizing this drug. So although relative to others in the diabetic class, it may not have the blood sugar reduction that others do, but the clinical evidence of the outcomes it produces in select individuals warrants its prescribing over other medications. Now, the second domain involves things like safety, ease of use, as well as reduced side effects. And this, of course, is incredibly important for individuals who have contraindications to certain medications, and therefore their safety can be at risk, or who have other health conditions that don't cooperate well with the medication due to a variety of factors. Sometimes just knowing that there's a reduction in potential side effects may encourage providers to prescribe this medication more frequently, even if there is similar efficacy to a cheaper alternative. Something that comes to mind for me is with migraine prophylaxis medications, we have very few studies that actually compare drug classes or individual drugs to one another. Most of them are just studied relative to placebo. Now, we do have one particular study that compared arunimab with topiramate. So it's Aimovig versus Topamax. Now, this study was the Hermes trial by Reuter and Associates. And no, it's not sponsored by the luxury brand that makes Birkin bags, but it is one of the very few studies that actually compares two prophylaxis medications against each other. Now, what we found in this study was that the topiramate had potential to, in select individuals, reduce the number of migraine days comparable to some in the Aimovig arm, as there is a large window for which the relief patients would receive. However, in the Aimovig arm, we did have more patients having a higher percentage of reduced migraine days with significantly less side effects. So while it's always possible that patients prescribed Topamax could have similar efficacy as well as no side effects, the likelihood that they will have side effects is much higher, and the likelihood that they will achieve the same reduction of migraine days is also lower relative to Aimovig, and therefore would likely persuade prescribers to choose Aimovig over something like Topamax. Now, ease of use can also have a major influence on whether something is prescribed for an individual. An example that comes to mind is when we think about the earlier GLP-1s that were developed and on market, such as Byetta and Victoza. They had much more frequent injections relative to those that are more commonly prescribed today. Byetta, being the first one on the market, had a twice-a-day injection regimen, which of course deterred its use and limited adherence to the medication. Victoza, likewise, was a once-a-day injection, so it was a little better, but the GLP-1s that we see on the market now are either a once-weekly injection, like our Mounjaros, our Trulicities, or they've adjusted the delivery form to something oral, like in Rybelsus. Now, most individuals don't want to be injecting themselves, and therefore, of course, are going to prefer a once-weekly injection or an oral tablet over twice-a-day, once-a-day injections. And the third domain can have nothing to do with clinical management of these drugs or side effects or the administration of them, and can have everything to do with the industry partners that actually facilitate the payment of the medications. Now, entities like PBMs may not discourage use of these high-cost medications and oftentimes may guide patients to their utilization for the reason that they will recoup some money from manufacturers in the form of rebates or aggregators like GPOs, and actually stand to benefit from the prescribing of these higher cost new medications. Of course, it's not just PBMs that stand to gain when newer high cost medications are being prescribed. Manufacturers, of course, derive the greatest benefit because they are the ones who ultimately the money trickles down to. So things like direct to consumer ads can certainly influence a patient wanting to get on a medication and therefore encouraging prescriber to prescribe that medication to them. And we often forget how much power patients actually have with their prescribers. Prescribers, of course, want to prescribe everything that is correct, but they also need to make sure that it's something that the patient's going to take. And when patient appointments are few and far between, could be 3, 6, 12 or greater months in between, prescriber needs to make sure that the medication being prescribed will be pretty tolerable for the patient and something they actually are willing to take. But it's not just direct-to-consumer ads that manufacturers use to drive utilization of their product. Another way in which manufacturers do this is by gaining FDA approval for indications beyond what the medication was first indicated for. Now, a great example of this is when it comes to biologic medications like Humira and Enbrel. They originally had indications for things like rheumatoid arthritis, but upon further evaluation showed efficacy for other inflammatory conditions, and therefore were able to extend that patent and market share by now having a newer indication. And of course, these guys are very clever, and it's all done very strategically to maximize the hold on the market share under the brand name reference product. So sometimes these factors under these domains can be good things. As I mentioned with Entresto earlier in the video, we're going to get better outcomes for patients, and we have proven data to support that. And therefore, of course, we want to have this medication available to these individuals. But this may not always be the case. As we talked about with prophylaxis migraine medications, just because it is a newer, higher cost drug doesn't necessarily mean that a patient won't have side effects or that they will have the reduction in migraine days the way it was represented in the study. There is still a great possibility that a lower cost medication will cause no side effect and also can achieve the efficacy that we're after. And we really can't stress enough how important it is that these higher cost medications are prescribed only when there is an absolute clinical benefit that is undeniable. The same thing goes for safety and side effects. Just because a drug has a listed monitoring or safety precaution doesn't mean that the patient will not be able to take it. Just because a drug is potentially hepatotoxic or can cause liver injury doesn't mean it necessarily will. And with the right monitoring, we likely can avoid this altogether before it escalates to something more serious. But this is kind of the problem that we face in healthcare. Because patients don't have readily access to providers, we have to prescribe things that we are less likely to have to micromanage and things that we can more set and forget. We also can't stress enough how important it is to have that proper alignment with the industry partners that you're using. Just because the PBM approved the use of a medication doesn't mean it is the lowest cost, most ideal solution. It really just means they think it's somewhat appropriate and they're going to get in a piece on the action. The take-home message today is that newer and more expensive doesn't always mean better. And taking the time to establish a second look at the utilization of these medications could mean the difference between something like Aimovig that costs nearly $9,600 a year, or something like topiramate that may cost something like $50 a year. And it is these very fine nuances that are being neglected in healthcare. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and check us out on LinkedIn. Take care.